Good evening. It was a little more than 50 years ago that President John F. Kennedy read The Other America, which was a short, myth-busting book by an American socialist named Michael Harrington. Like Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, this was a book that would transform public opinion. Quote, "Tens of millions of Americans," Harrington wrote, "are maimed in body and spirit, existing at levels beneath those necessary for human decency." President Kennedy was said to have been moved by Harrington's assertion that a quarter of all Americans were living at or near the poverty level. Historians tell us that The Other America was also read by Lyndon Johnson, and that it was one inspiration for the war on poverty. In fact, the book sold more than 1 million copies. But more importantly, the LBJ domestic programs and those of Richard Nixon later on significantly reduced the number of Americans living below the poverty line. Yet, by the 1980s, the word poverty had disappeared from the national discourse. If people spoke of the problem at all, they mentioned symptoms like homelessness or hunger, or less sympathetically, welfare queens. Indeed, by the last presidential election, the poor, for the most part, and their plight was absent as a campaign issue. And yet, their numbers had grown for the first time since the Great Depression. In this lecture series, we hope to honor the power of books like The Other America by, in some small way, putting the term poverty back into play. Towards that end, we've invited 3 writers who use the word clearly and use it often to join us here on this stage for live interviews. Next month, Barbara Ehrenreich will tell us how she came to write her bestseller, Nickeled and Dimed. And then in May, Paul Farmer will introduce his new book and talk about his continuing efforts to save lives in Haiti. And tonight, we open the series with Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, the director of Columbia University's Earth Institute and the founding director of the Millennium Villages Project. What makes Dr. Sachs different from just about any writer I know of is that he's moved an incredible theory into massive practice. The Millennium Villages Project is changing the lives of 500,000 of the rural poor in countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi. You know, at the New York Times, we're generally barred from using the term Renaissance man. It's just not something you're allowed to use. But Jeffrey Sachs is really that. There's no other word. We know him, of course, as a celebrated economist putting out ideas that are neither traditionally liberal or conservative, but often an unclassifiable blend of idealistic and pragmatic. At the age of 28, Sachs was already a full professor of economics at Harvard. As a young economist, he helped the government of Bolivia get its foreign debt renegotiated. Then, as communism imploded, he was a key advisor to the Polish and then later to the Russian governments as they made their transitions into a market economy. In recent years, Dr. Sachs has partnered with UN General Secretaries Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon to create the Millennium Villages projects. In his spare time, though it's hard to believe he has any, he's written 3 bestsellers, including The End of Poverty, which dared to suggest that the world could stop tolerating extreme poverty. And also his current bestseller, which is called The Price of Civilization, Reawakening American Virtue and Prosperity, which he'll be autographing later in the lounge. Full disclosure before we begin, one of the courses that I teach at Columbia is seated within the Earth Institute. though this evening's the first time I've ever met Professor Sachs. That said, it's time to meet our guest. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to the 92nd Street Live.
Thanks so much.
Hi.
Good evening.
Let's begin with something that was in the New York Times this morning. It's a good story with an edge. In Mississippi, an infant girl appears to have been cured of HIV after being given antivirals within hours of her birth. According to what my colleague Don McNeil wrote, quote, "The mother arrived at a rural hospital in the fall of 2010, already in labor, and gave birth prematurely. She had not seen a doctor during pregnancy and did not know she had HIV." Is this something one expects in America?
Of course, it's a tragedy, but we do expect it because we know that a lot of people do not have access, awareness, or ability to get the kind of health care or self-knowledge of their own health that they need. And we have an ongoing AIDS epidemic in this country, but it's in minority groups, it's in groups that are not part of the mainstream of society by and large, so it's put out of sight, out of mind, and unsolved. What is amazing is the good news, as you say, that for the first time, maybe the second time, depending on how you describe it, there seems to have been actually a cure, which gives the idea that maybe there is still a way through this very complicated disease to get to something more than we have now, which itself is a great breakthrough, an ability to stay alive, also to prevent the transmission. If this young woman had known that she was HIV positive, now it's possible with almost 100% success to prevent the virus from being transmitted to the newborn. She didn't know. The baby did get the virus. The doctor tested the infant, the newborn, and then started this treatment. And lo and behold, when the mother stopped using the antiretrovirals counter to medical advice, the disease did not recur. So a little miracle has happened. A lot of scientists are going to be studying this for a while now.
In the fall of 2011, you went down to Zuccotti Park and spoke to the demonstrators at Occupy Wall Street. For an economist who often hangs out with folks like Bill Gates and Soros and Warren Buffett and Kofi Annan, this was a big step. What moved you to go?
It's nice to be down at Wall Street, especially yelling at all those bankers. And boy, do they deserve it. My wife, who's here, and I went down the first time just to see because the park had just been occupied. And it was fantastic. First, you heard slogans that we all came to know, but we are the 99%. And I remember the first moment I heard that. That's good. That is really right. And I thought that there was really something there. And then what really impressed me the first time we went down to the park was as the red double-deckers came by Zuccotti Park, the people on the top deck were cheering the young people occupying the park. And that was expressing the public mood. And I think the public mood was anger and feeling that Wall Street and the bankers and the rich had not only let us down miserably, which they had, and now we know how many laws they broke and how completely corrupted and criminal Wall Street has been for years and years, but how nothing was being done about it. It was complete impunity. So this was really tapping a mood that I thought was on target, and I started going down to the park on a few occasions afterwards, and that human mic system where you spoke, and then because they weren't allowed to have a real microphone in the park, so the crowds would chant every sentence that you said. A little bit interesting to give a speech that way, and it had a big effect in a very short period of time. It tapped something real. It was extremely vivid. The world media could descend on this park and use it as a visual to discuss issues that hadn't been discussed in America for years or decades. The massive inequality, the impunity that the bankers had gotten, the criminality that led to 2008, the financial crisis and all the rest. And it was building, and it was having a big effect. And it was having such a big effect that, of course, the powers that be ended up sending in the police and sending the kids away, and then it collapsed as a movement in and of itself, because in our country, media is everything, and when the media did not have a picture to show, they lost interest.
Well, the interesting thing also about Occupy Wall Street was that it was the first time, I think in my lifetime, that people actually, certainly the first time since the 60s, that people were talking about economic issues. As an economist, do you find it hard to, given cultural kind of prohibitions against talking about economics, and then just the complicatedness of it, do you find it hard to talk about your business to the public?
Right now, there's so much disdain for politicians, so much cynicism and skepticism. It's easy to talk about all the things that are wrong, but if you try to say how something might be better, then you're already deeply suspect. So the mood right now is really of a lot of unhappiness and a general feeling of letdown. And the issues are unfortunately complicated, and there are a lot of voices. People talk about these issues incessantly, but we don't seem to be able to find our way out of any of them.
Well, the one thing I get from reading your books is a kind of optimism. You take very big problems, poverty, and you say they can be solved. Is there something in your character where you're sort of born optimistic, and that makes it possible for you to take these big issues and say, I'll take them apart, I think we can do them?
Well, there's one thing that makes it easy, which is that you can point to places where it's actually happening. And so just about anything I'm saying isn't invented by me. It's saying, look, this has already been done in X, Y, and Z. You don't need magic to do it. And it does seem to me basically very, very strange and anachronistic that in this world of incredible wealth and technology, you have people dying of hunger. You have people dying, of course, of lack of access to safe water or simple medicine. It's nuts. And it is fundamentally a combination of basic morality, as I see it at least. Everyone can choose their own morality, but I think it's wrong to let people die, and that's a pretty basic point. And then a little bit of systems thinking and observation. It doesn't have to be like this. We live in a world where the average income in the world is $10,000 per person. So that's enough to not only stay alive, but to flourish. People shouldn't be dying of having nothing. Of course, in the United States, the average income is $50,000, and then you regard the fact that just a little over 1,000 billionaires in the world have $4.5 trillion of wealth, and they by themselves could solve this problem if they got around to it. So these are solvable issues objectively. It's not that there's some heroism or fantasy in this, but we're not organized to solve a lot of these issues. And what fascinates me and troubles me and motivates me is to try to figure out how to get some organization around some of these things so that you can actually do what obviously could be done from a technical and resource point of view, to do it in an actual way. And that's what motivates me.
You grew up in Detroit. Your father was a labor lawyer. How did that impact your thinking? I know he represented policemen and public employees.
Well, it had a huge effect. You know, for me, I could watch the progression. My father's parents were, they arrived in the U.S. as immigrants from Russia at age 2 or 3. They worked manual labor all their lives, never had more than a couple of years of education. And they, with that incredible effort, put several children, despite their poverty and the Great Depression and all the rest, put several children through college, including my father. And my dad then early on got a scholarship from the UAW. This was Detroit. This was the Motor City, and it was the center of unionism in the United States. And he got to know, from a very young age, Walter Reuther and other leaders of the labor movement. And my dad took those values, and they were, for me, it was always wonderful to watch him, because they were, his sense of justice was just effortless. It wasn't a construct or something he had. It just felt natural. I think having grown up in poverty and understanding the way the world was, and in the early 60s when the civil rights movement came, we had a lot of civil rights activists come through our house, and it was, for me, completely and utterly formative. There's no doubt about it.
Is there, I suppose it's kind of an immature Freudianism almost to ask if isn't in some way you're meeting your father's expectations in your own way in how you're doing things?
I think, you know, the community that I grew up in Jewish community, and basically an immigrant community, or one generation in America, first loved this country, second expected improvement, third embodied a Jewish value which I hold very dear called tikkun olam, the idea in Jewish tradition that part of your responsibility as a human being is to try to fix the fabric of the world. And that was everywhere in the community. It was just taken for granted. You're supposed to do good. You're here to do something useful. And I rather like that. You know, it's, I think every religion has that impulse, at least in some aspects of the religion, and I find that a wholly attractive way to live. And you know, the psychologists tell us now it also is a happier way to live, actually, than all those sad rich bankers who somehow have forgotten this and who have made the pursuit of money upon money upon money the ultimate end. And it does seem to be pretty destructive if you follow that kind of course.
Well, you do a lot of fundraising with those sad rich bankers.
I know. I'm trying to help them find meaning in their lives, and I assure them that there's a way to do it.
Yeah.
But I don't mince my words. Also, you know.
Yeah. What do you, give us a pitch that you might pretend that I'm a Jamie Dimon or something.
Look, you know, first of all, there are important things to do, and there's no way that you, your family, your children, your whole community could ever spend all that money anyway. And I like to remind people when they don't shut me out that Andrew Carnegie had it right more than 100 years ago. He invented modern philanthropy, actually. And he said, you know, I'm just very good at making money because I'm very good at managing things, but the wealth that I make is not really mine. It's, he said, it's held in trust for the community. And if a rich man dies rich, it's a shame on them. It's not their money, it's money that they are holding in trust. And he said, Carnegie said that therefore, you know, we should use, or he should use his management expertise to actually solve some problems in the U.S. And he did, by the way, and he inspired John D. Rockefeller, who had a bit of money himself, And this is the 100th anniversary of the Rockefeller Foundation this year. And I regard that institution as the single most successful organization in the 20th century history in fighting poverty. It just did everything. It made vaccines and invented public health and solved the hookworm epidemic in the U.S. South and helped Brazil get rid of falciparum malaria and just did amazing, amazing things. And it proved to me, as I was a student and studying these things, yet again, these are solvable problems. And there was a time, by the way, and you started with Michael Harrington's book, there was a time when there was a lot of faith. These are solvable problems. We had a president who said we're going to have a war on poverty. You can't even imagine that now. Shame that you can't. But we said we're going on, and by the way, of course, the biggest joke and tragedy of it is that it was incredibly successful. So successful that the right went after in a wild and persistent campaign to say that it was a massive failure when it was, in fact, by every statistical measure you can find, an enormous success. But it was closed down just about as fast as it started. And of course, Johnson made the historic mistake of Vietnam, which did more damage than anything else to undermine what was a brilliant effort and a successful one.
Do you see any parallels today in the campaigns against Social Security and entitlements?
Well, of course, we've had in the American right an opposition to all of this from the 30s onward, and Franklin Roosevelt, who I think was America's greatest president of all time, was completely hated and despised for everything he did, including introducing Social Security and all the rest. And Roosevelt was such a great guy that he said, they hate me and I welcome their hate. He just had guts, and he knew the class that he came from, and he knew to stand up to them.
So a modern politician couldn't bear being hated that way.
I think that they couldn't bear the thought that maybe David Koch or someone else is going to use their wealth to run campaign ads against them. Now money so infiltrates the whole system that these politicians are just dialing for dollars all the time, and they're scared of the money. They're also, politics has become an incredible science, not in doing anything good, but in how to dissect a precinct to get votes. And so the the political advisors are utter professionals in vote seeking and power seeking, but they ensure that a leading politician does nothing that hasn't been focus grouped and tested and polled. And so we've basically gutted real leadership. And we have this pseudo leadership and a lot of media oriented speechifying that doesn't amount to anything. So yes, it's not like it used to be. And we had two great Roosevelts, and I hope we have a third one. We need a third one.
Any Roosevelt in mind?
Well, look, I mean, we had two Roosevelts, one a Republican, one a Democrat, who both stood up to powerful interests, said, we got to fix this country. And that's what we thought Barack Obama was going to do. He turned out not to do it. But he won the first election absolutely saying he was going to do it, didn't do it, but it shows that America's ready to vote for someone that actually is going to make that change.
My husband, who is a political scientist, his name is Andrew Hacker, and
a great political scientist.
Indeed, a great political scientist. Hello, sweetheart. He says that in the last election, that Americans just knew what they didn't want this country to be. And they voted very much for the soul of the country rather than on the non-issues they were presented with. Do you agree with that?
Look, I think in 2008, Barack Obama's victory was a miracle and wonderful and inspiring, and walking the streets of New York that evening was, one of the most glorious moments. And I happened to, my wife and I happened to be with Ted and Gillian Sorensen that night, and when we celebrated Obama's victory, it just seemed that everything was possible. And I believe that a lot was possible then, actually. And in America, political leadership resides with the president. That's how our constitutional system works. And the president has uniquely the bully pulpit, and in early 2009, people were scared, rightly so. They were disgusted, rightly so. George W. Bush was, I think, America's worst president in history, with the possible exception of James Buchanan, and I've never really sorted that out because I don't have a real good recollection of 1857. But Barack Obama could have done a lot more, but he chose not to.
And he chose an economics team that came straight from Bill Clinton.
Yes, and from Wall Street, and he continues with that. And it's one of the mysteries. Some people say it's obvious, that's what American power is about, and there's some truth to that. He raised a lot of money from Wall Street, both in 2008 and again in 2012. Big money elected him, even though there were a lot of small donors, so that's true. But maybe it was just because he was inexperienced or didn't have his own team or hadn't really known these issues, so he took them off the shelf, actually. And he took the Clinton team and he took Bob Rubin's team. And there's not a single person, I think, in senior economic position that has not been a Bob Rubin acolyte since the start of the Obama administration. And we got a lot of more of the same.
Well, one question that people often ask, at least people I speak to, they don't understand, for instance, why there haven't at least been more civil prosecutions of the wrongdoing.
Hey, why not criminal prosecutions?
Well, at least civil.
Yeah, but look, if you watch the press, the financial press, it's unbelievable. Every single day there's a new fine being paid, new settlements. Wall Street was a criminal enterprise for many years. Shocking, despicable, and still the same heads of these banks, and they're still at the state dinners at the White House. And you look, I'm actually starting to do it. If someone else has done it, I'd love to know. If you make a list of all that has gone on, it is pages and pages and pages of settlements. There are so many abuses, and it's every day the next one, whether it's the LIBOR scandal or this one or that one. And when you travel abroad, and broken banks everywhere, our banks were always party to that, because our banks were selling garbage abroad in 2007, 2008. We know now how the system worked, that they had constructed these toxic portfolios and knowingly sold them. And this was the greatest game in town, and it broke places all over the world.
So as far as you know...
And nobody has paid anything for it, except fines of shareholders. But people responsible, they've walked away with tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of bonuses. No one said boo about it, including the White House.
So as far as you know, what has changed, if anything?
Very little.
So where are things going to go? Societies that work are based on trust. Are people going to be able to continue to trust in the system?
People don't trust in the system right now. And it's a very complicated period that we're in worldwide, not just here. It's not just that we had a financial crisis, which would be enough. It's not just that we had impunity of financial deregulation started by Bill Clinton and that led to this massive explosion. It's not that we've had unaccountability. the world is changing in massive ways, and probably a rate of change as fast as in any time in history. We have massive technological change that is eliminating jobs of high school grads or manual labor or assembly line labor, which used to be a way, at least for working class, to earn a living and be able to buy a house and enter at least a modest middle class life. Those are gone. They're either offshore or they've been automated away or they've been robotized away, so the jobs don't exist anymore. Massive change of that. Of course, geopolitics is changing before our eyes, and the rise of China and other regional powers is huge. Environmental change is as dangerous as Hurricane Sandy reminded us. Those extreme events are happening all over the world, and they're going to come with greater frequency. You'd think in all of this we might say, we've arrived in the 21st century, maybe we ought to do something, but we're paralyzed. And we're not paralyzed because of a divide of left and right. That's the theater. Actually, both parties are pretty much on the same line. That's the truth. That's the unpleasant truth. People hate it when I say it, by the way, because, we're engaged. You want to be engaged. I'm a partisan. It's the Republicans. Of course, I find what the Republicans are doing disgusting, but I find what the Democrats are doing pretty unattractive also. The Republicans do it with glee. The Democrats do it wringing their hands knowing that something's wrong, but they're still doing the same stuff. And so, yeah, we're not in a good shape. I can tell you, but I don't think it's news.
So the State of the Union.
Yes.
President Obama said the words that people had wanted him to say for a long time: climate change.
Right.
Does that make any difference that he said it?
We had a Nobel laureate, Secretary of Energy for 4 years in the first term, Stephen Chu. How many times did you see him give a speech? Do you remember? They locked him up somewhere because he might say something against somebody's interest. So he's gone. I think I can guess what the president's going to do on climate change, which is he's, at least he believes in it. That's good. That's separate. I mean, probably everyone there are a lot of people that say they don't believe in it, but they're on the take of the oil companies, so they don't believe in it. But President Obama does believe in it, and he's probably ready to lead EPA to issue some regulations against coal-fired power plants. But watch how much drilling is done, watch how the fracking is going to continue and how proud the administration is going to be, and I would guess overwhelmingly that he's going to approve the Keystone Pipeline very soon. So we're going to get a little bit of step on one aspect of climate change. We're going to get rhetoric, which we get, and we're going to get a lot of new fossil fuel development. And my guess is we will get no national plan for how we're actually going to take carbon out of the energy system. And that's what the President of the United States ought to be doing, is preparing a plan to actually have a way forward for this country, because every part of the world needs to do that. And we're not doing it, of course, on our own. The fact that we're not doing it gives a license to China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, not to do it. And so the world's in a perfect stalemate, except for one thing, which we're emitting 34 billion tons of CO2 every year. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is rising at an unprecedented rate. The climate is becoming more and more unstable. That's the one part that isn't in a stalemate, is we're wrecking the atmosphere, wrecking the climate.
So where were you during Hurricane Sandy or Tropical Storm Sandy or whatever it was? Were you around?
Of course, one of the advantages of being director of the Earth Institute is you get to call your colleagues and find out exactly where the storm is, why, and and try to understand what was happening. And it was so sad for us. Many of the scientists at the Earth Institute, like Klaus Jacob, had been saying for years, New York is going to flood. we've had about 1 foot rise of the sea level during the past century because of global warming, basically thermal expansion, plus the melting of ice sheets and glaciers and so forth, raising the ocean level. That means that if you take a massive storm and a much higher sea level, you get flooding. And the scientists at the Earth Institute had identified, here's how the flooding is going to be, because you can make a map of New York and the low-lying areas and so forth. And they identified which places the subways were going to flood. And it's not all of them, but certain of the entry points. And they also identified the kind of plans that, that could prevent this. And of course, very, very little had been done. Very little had been anticipated. A country which prides itself on, we can do anything, though Katrina had given us a hint that maybe that wasn't so. A storm that hit the most sophisticated center of the world economy, Wall Street after all, lost electricity for weeks, couldn't get gasoline in the pumps to even get the vehicles filled again, gas tanks filled again, and it has taken months, and there still is a lot of rebuilding to do. And the point is, this is going to be happening more and more, and we're just drifting into it. You remember that during the campaign, climate change, it was mentioned one time when the president gave his acceptance speech at the convention. He mentioned the phrase, then not mentioned again at all until Sandy, and then Bloomberg made a strong endorsement of the president, and the president said something about climate change, and then he said it again, and we're not going to hear too much more about it. That's the basic point. It's amazing. So you say, why take on this issue? Why take on this complicated issue? A, it's going to ruin a lot of what we hold dear if we don't. Second, we're in an age of incredible technology. Solar power has come down from $50 a watt to 70 cents a watt during the last 30 years. So now renewables like solar or offshore wind could power a tremendous amount of the US economy if we got serious. So there are solutions. The US government is completely paralyzed by politics, and the oil lobby is the world's most powerful lobby, and the politicians won't touch it. And here we are.
Well, here we are. I was going to ask before, while I look through these questions, does the White House ever call you down to talk to them?
No.
No?
No.
When was the last time, have you met Obama?
Oh, yeah.
What were the circumstances?
No, I met him a couple of times and had talks with him, gave my thoughts.
And?
I think they have an approach. And that approach has worked from the point of view of the politician. It's gotten him elected, miracle A. It's gotten him reelected, very good. And it's led to the sequester this week, disaster. And I tried to tell him for years exactly this. I went back to the first article I wrote in Time magazine, January 2009, that said fiscal policy is going to be the stumbling block. There are not enough revenues. He can give temporary tax cuts. It's not going to do almost anything. If he makes them permanent, bigger disaster. This is going to be the make or break. And you could see it in the numbers 4 years ago that was the central issue. It remains the central issue. I felt that he needed a very different set of tactics as well as strategy to stand up to what was the biggest assault on government in modern times. But I think he dropped the ball. And the reason he dropped the ball was to get elected, he championed the Bush-era tax cuts to make them permanent for 98% of Americans. They were unaffordable when Bush did it, and he made them permanent. And it turned out not for 98%, but for 99%. That was the deal that was reached on January 1st. And so he gave away, in my opinion, I call it giving away, $4 trillion of revenues over the next 10 years by signing onto the permanency of these tax cuts. And then the next day said, oh my God, we're going to have to cut government. And it's going to be a disaster. Well, come on. Do a little arithmetic and think ahead and help the American people understand what this is about. And veto the extension of the tax cuts. Don't support it. Why is he championing it? Now we have no money to do anything, and we're cutting programs. And I think he gambled, by the way, you know, as a lot of the news analysts are saying, he gambled that the Republicans would back down, but this is their shining glory. They're cutting the government that they hate so much. And we're going to pay a bad price for it.
I hate to cut you off, but there are wonderful questions from the audience. One viewer asks, how is climate change linked to poverty?
Well, first, the poor get hit disastrously. The poor get hit first with everything. And so no matter what the crisis, if you have no margin of safety, you're going to suffer very badly what is only a modest shock for people with means. But the poor people around the world live, not coincidentally, in very difficult environments. I work a lot in what's called the dryland areas, places where the amount of rainfall is hardly enough to have a seasonal crop. Usually, you're always on the verge of crop failure. Well, places like Mali, which is now in war, or Somalia, which has been in chaos for 20 years, are dryland places that have suffered a further decline of rainfall because very likely because of human-induced climate change. And then war breaks out and chaos, and we send the drone missiles, but we're going to be making more and more places in the world uninhabitable. And what's our strategy? Building taller walls on the Rio Grande and shooting people to try to cross the border. This is not an approach of decency, sense, or security.
Well, since you brought up Mali, I know that in your books you talk about how the poverty programs that you suggest, particularly ones that involve more foreign aid, need a two-tier approach and should be thought of as basically a national security move. Do you think the situation in Mali, which is mystifying to most people, most Americans don't know where it is on a map, is one of these cases that was preventable?
By the way, if you don't know where it is on the map, when I was invited as a tenured Harvard professor to my first practical problem solving, which was in Bolivia, as you nicely mentioned, and they asked me to come to Bolivia, I had to go home and look on a map where it was. So we're not good in geography. Since then, I've learned where a few places are.
I have a shower curtain that has a map of everything.
That's good.
But unfortunately, it's pre-1990.
Right.
It's on plastic, and the borders have changed massively.
So Mali is a landlocked country just south of the Sahara Desert, and it's extraordinarily poor. It has all the risk factors for poverty, which is being landlocked is a source of poverty. Being in drylands is a source of poverty. Being just south of the Sahara is a poverty factor. And when I first met President Obama in April and May 2009, I showed him a map from a book that I had written where I overlaid the conflict zones with the dryland zones. And the conflicts in this world Mali, for example, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, they're all part of this dryland belt. And I said, that's not coincidence. These are hungry people. And when famine comes, hungry people are easy to recruit for terrorism, or their places become unstable, and you get an incursion of outside forces, as happened with this Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb in the case of Mali. It's pretty predictable, by the way, and actually there are even mathematical models that show that when the rains fail, the wars start. Not hugely surprising, but pretty strong statistically. And I showed them the map, showed them the overlay, and we just can't get our foreign policy mindset around this. And Mali, who cares about Mali, we're told. Mali, who cares? Until all of a sudden there's a coup, unrest, the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Now we're setting up a drone missile base in Niger next door. Come on. Are you kidding? We're going to police thousands of miles of semi-desert, and a drone isn't going to make a bore well. A drone isn't going to build a clinic. A drone isn't going to build a school. A drone isn't going to make the herdsman resilient against a drought. What are we doing? It's unbelievable. But by the way, in Washington, they don't know. They don't know. They don't go to Mali. They don't know, honestly. You'd be surprised.
They don't know where it is
I don't know
either.
I don't know if they know where it is on a map either. No, it's just amazing. It's really depressing. For years, the president of Mali, before he was deposed by a coup of, it just goes on and on. Anyway, he asked me to help to mobilize international support for the 166 poorest communes in his country, most of which were in the Tuareg region in the north, that he knew this is a risk. I couldn't get any interest in the State Department, couldn't get any interest in the White House, couldn't get any interest in the World Bank. Nobody cares. This is Mali. Come on, grow up. Until this happens. And then there's lots of interest, but it's interest about drones. And the same exact thing happened. My wife, who's here, can testify that we were invited by President Saleh of Yemen before he was thrown out in the same kind of unrest to look at Yemen. I was completely shocked. I'd only been to Yemen once in 2005, and you saw the hunger, you saw the drought, you saw the climate problems, you saw the poverty, lack of infrastructure. I came back, I said, that place is going to blow, which of course it did a few years later. No interest at all. That's modern day America. We used to actually pay attention to that stuff for a while, but we paid attention to it because there was a Cold War, so if we didn't, the Soviets would. Now that the Soviet Union's gone, we don't have to pay attention, we think. Strange, yeah? It is strange. Really strange.
There's a member of the audience named Carolyn who asks, what are some things ordinary citizens can do to solve the problem of increasing income inequality in the USA? What do you think?
Let me describe a little bit of why we have it, and then maybe we can brainstorm about what can be done. Inequality has soared basically since the early 1980s. And there's some mystery of exactly what factors are at play, but I mentioned a few of them already.
Tax
So
codes,
one thing is the global economy really hit the unskilled workers in this country. That's one. Second, technological change has probably also played against unskilled workers because a lot has been automated or offshored as well. Then what was weird about the US in this period was that as market forces were hitting the poor, government, instead of leaning against that, which is normally what you might expect government to do, saying, oh, markets are really pressing the poor, we should help. Markets weighed in because Ronald Reagan came January 20th, 1981, and he said the solution to our problem is not government, government is the problem. And he started this whole phase that we've been in for the last 30 plus years of cutting taxes for the rich, taking away responsibility, deregulating, bashing the unions, which of course he started with the air traffic controllers and all the rest. And so politics definitely weighed in. And then, you know, all our companies with the connivance of the politicians and the IRS learned how to put all their operations in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda and the British Virgin Islands and so forth. Mitt Romney helped us to understand this a little more clearly during the election campaign, but it's a completely pervasive phenomenon that our big companies, Google and Apple and many others, with IRS approval, have been able to park their profits in these tax havens. And so we have market forces and political forces working in the same direction. And what the market forces show us is that skills and education still are absolutely key. If you don't have a high school degree, unemployment is 12% or higher. If you have a bachelor's degree or above, the unemployment rate last month was 3.7%. So we have a skill and education gradient which has become a lot steeper. And those at the bottom that don't have access or opportunity are really suffering. And America's become, surprisingly, completely against all our self-mythos in this country. We've become the most tracked, least socially mobile of any high-income country in the world now. Meaning, when the scorekeeper of this, the so-called OECD, measures this, if you look at the link of the parents' socioeconomic status and their children's, or the parents' educational attainment and their children's, the link is strongest in the United States. If you're born into affluence, you'll stay affluent. You could do quite well. The rich are doing great, by the way. Great. Not just okay, great. And if you're born into poverty, to escape poverty in this country is harder than it's ever been. And you're basically locked into place right now. If you're born into poverty, maybe your father's in jail, because we've got more than 2 million young people incarcerated in this crazy system of ours. And your neighborhood and the schools and everything else is just replicating this poverty across generations now. And tuition costs to get that extra edge have soared, of course, and that means that you can't bridge this on your own. So we have successfully put students into $1 trillion of student debt at this point.
Well, that leads to, there are a pile of
So I didn't answer the question of what to do, because the real answer, you know, individually, it's basically, if you can, stay in school and understand that this is absolutely crucial. There are no jobs out of poverty for people with just a high school education in this country right now. That's one part. But the second part is politics and policy. And of course, both parties fail on this. This is the very sad point that we've been talking about.
Many of the viewers here in the audience asked about college costs. It's the issue that comes closest to home. And one person writes, should third-level ed in the U.S. be subsidized as it is in Europe? Is the cost of this education creating a huge and growing poverty gap in the U.S., as you alluded to? Do you think something should be done about college tuition other than more student loans? No,
I think that actually this model is going to break anyway. But I'm a fan. Other people are not. But I'm a believer that information technology and online and other things are going to end up making a big difference, and for good. good reason. And I believe in the future, I know the day is coming when if I get paid for lectures, it's going to be a 99-cent download rather than some other way, because we're all going to go on iTunes or whatever.
No, it's going to be somebody pirating your download.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, as you know, as the artists tell us, you don't even get the 99 cents. So there is going to be a change in this. The current model is not right, and it's not necessary, actually. And what's interesting, by the way, if in Germany, which isn't perfect by any means on this, they have a massive effort to develop skills of young people and to help make that transition from school to jobs. And so their youth unemployment in this time of crisis everywhere is about the lowest in their history. Actually, it's unbelievable. So they're one of the few countries that has, and it's a large country, it's 85 million people, they've been able to create a system in which young people get trained, they get, whether it's vocational or tertiary education of what we would call a bachelor's degree, that actually makes a transition to work in an effective way.
Now, here's an interesting question, at least a different one. Someone asks, there are some variations in perception of economic problems, world issues among people of different generations. What do you believe is the most important difference in thought, and why? What I think this correspondent is asking is a question that my generation asked. Is there a generational difference in the same way that there are class differences? And in the end, we said no, but we thought it for a long time.
Yeah, I think that the change in the world and in the economy and in technology means necessarily for young people the economy and their choices and their opportunities are really different from a generation, my generation, from even, of course, more removed from my parents' generation, which we talked about briefly. So I do think that there no doubt are differences of perception, but there are huge differences of reality. What kinds of jobs are there? What is a way to make your way in America now? It's very, very different from 20 or 30 years ago. There really used to be industrial jobs, and you used to be able to go to high school and then go, whether it was wonderful or not, go to a local factory, and that was enough, as I said, to at least gain a foothold into America's vast middle class. That kind of track doesn't exist anymore. And in this sense, the reality of young people today really is different. The kinds of jobs, the service economy, a knowledge-based economy, the income disparities really are a phenomenon, and the reality of a global labor market.
This is a question from Montclair, New Jersey, in line with this. And I know you have children of college age, high school age. This person asks, as the parent of 2 high school children who are college bound, what do I tell them so that they might prepare themselves for a future in a globalized economy? What do you tell your kids?
Well, whatever I tell them, they've got their own ideas.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So that's the one thing I've learned very, very clearly. I most importantly, I want my kids to be engaged in the world and to take themselves, but also their responsibilities seriously, whatever they decide to do. Of course, I've tried, have worked hard to try to promote the values of education, which I deeply believe in, obviously, as someone completely committed to this. But they'll find their own way, and they teach you a lot, obviously, about that.
Well, they have parents. One parent is an economist, global thinker, and the other is a pediatrician and public health expert, what do they want to be with role models like that?
Well, all very different. And our older daughter works in issues of globalization and sustainable development, and especially foreign investment law. And she keeps me rightly oriented, and can be a very tough critic if I get out of line. And our son is an aspiring novelist, so didn't get it from his parents. And so it's quite wonderful. And of course, I encourage them to follow what they want. And our youngest is still with us in high school in her final year.
I understand you've been traveling to Bhutan a lot, the Himalayan kingdom that has opened up and is to the top corner of my shower curtain. It's a unique place because they don't just measure, as we know, the gross national product, but something else.
Yeah, so a lot of people are becoming aware of a rather remarkable statement and initiative that their fourth king launched about 40 years ago, when he said we should not chase the gross national product, but we should promote gross national happiness, and coined the idea of GNH. And this was taken, people chuckled at it or found it, amusing or curious. But actually, of course, they're onto something, and they're onto something important. And the world is now beating its path to Bhutan to try to understand a little bit more of this. Of course, there's some great and ancient Buddhist philosophy that is part of this, and there's some very practical realities of economic life. One thing is a famous finding in the United States. For 50 years, 60 years now, we've been asking people in surveys, how do you rate your life satisfaction? Or how happy are you? And so these are called measures of subjective well-being. And Richard Easterlin at Penn noticed back in around 1985 that if you graph the levels of reported well-being, it's flat for about 30 years, even as per capita income is rising sharply. And it seemed weird. America's getting richer and richer, but the reported life satisfaction is completely unchanged. And that article, which became called the Easterlin Paradox, was written almost 30 years ago, and since then it's remained true. Now, the Buddha would not be surprised at this. He said that chasing material wants would not lead to happiness. And Aristotle, from our neck of the woods, also would not have been completely shocked. But our society is organized around income as the ultimate measure of well-being, and economists, are very unhappy about this paradox, because what's the point of economics if they think if higher income doesn't really get you very far? What it does suggest to me is a little bit more nuanced. First, there's no question if you're poor, higher income makes you happier. So this point should not...
It can at least buy you health insurance when you need it.
It can buy you life survival and food to eat, and not watching your children writhe in agony. So it can make a big difference. Economists have known for a while, even economists, that there's something called declining marginal utility of income, which is when you have a lot of money, the next dollar isn't worth all that much. I think for us, the paradox is if we're not getting all that much out of that extra 0.5% of growth, which is all that people talk about, will the economy grow 2.5% or 3%? And if it doesn't really make so much difference of our well-being, maybe we don't want to wreck the planet, for example, destroy the climate, destroy biodiversity for the sake of something which isn't actually making us happier to begin with. So there's a fairly significant move now to try to measure beyond GNP, as it's called. And some of it is a worldwide movement to actually measure this well-being or happiness directly. I was a co-author with two wonderful experts in this area. I'm just an amateur in this, but two experts, Richard Laird and John Helliwell. We issued the first World Happiness Report last year, looking at all the data comparing well-being of countries. The United States is, somewhere in the middle of the list. The happiest countries are the Scandinavian social democracies, like Denmark, by one standard, is at the top of the list, and Copenhagen's a really nice place, by the way. People are happy. And the other place, very, very happy, is Costa Rica, which by all accounts is much poorer than the United States, but they eliminated their army 50, 60 years ago. They take a great pride and care of their natural environment. They have a lot of social equity in providing health care. People live long, healthy lives, even at a much lower level of income, and they're happy. So there's a lot to learn from this, and I think Bhutan has opened a window and opened a questioning that's not going to be so easy to put away, even though there are a lot of economists and others say, stop that, that's nonsense. There's a lot of interest in this now.
So, how to put this politely?
Okay.
Of all the many things you do, the Millennium Villages, the fundraising, the demonstrating, the writing of books, the being a professor, you are one of the few star professors I know of who teaches an undergraduate course. The running of a 900-person institute at Columbia. Does that make you happy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
The world's a little frustrating when you're trying to get something done. But it's also, for me, pretty wonderful to have had the chance and to have the chance to be meeting and working with people from all over the world across every culture, race, religion, and finding a lot of common humanity in that. And that, to me, is the most wonderful thing, and it's why I was in Senegal 3 days ago. I think I'm so jet-lagged I don't remember exactly where I was when, but in Senegal, and we were having a brainstorming meeting with professors from Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Cape Verde. That's fun, and working on hard problems of how pastoralists can use information technology and how we could get distance learning to kids in nomadic communities, and how we can use the collapsed price of photovoltaics to get solar power to people that are hundreds of miles away from a power grid. Yeah, it's fun. I recommend it.
So part of the ingredients to that happiness index is be very busy, do lots of things, and make the world better.
Have a high tolerance for jet lag and low sleep, but I think it really, the person who's reputed to be the world's happiest person by reputation is a monk, Mathieu Ricard, who some people know as the French monk who was a child of a famous journalist in France. This young man studied biology with the Nobel laureate Jacques Monod, and then went off one summer to the Himalayas and spent a few weeks in a Buddhist settlement and fell in love with Buddhism and became a Buddhist monk, to the chagrin of his parents at the time. After years of training in meditation and in Buddhist philosophy, first, he's a wonderful person, and he is very happy. But under an MRI, he's able to go into a meditative state almost immediately. And when you look at the neurological correlates of happiness, which is a brain flushed with serotonin and other neurotransmitters, he just turns it on, so the whole brain goes into this active state as he meditates. And so he's been declared by neurological standards the world's happiest person. And he is very happy, and he preaches and he says basically the Buddhist philosophy that compassion is the only route to happiness. And he's got a nice line that if you think that sensual stimulation and chasing material goods is the way to happiness, no, that's the way to exhaustion. Compassion is the only approach to happiness, and I think he's got something to it.
Well, on that note, it's been a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you very much.
And for all that you do.
Thanks a lot.
I understand that Dr. Sachs will be meeting with you in the lounge and signing his latest book. So we invite you to join us there, and we invite you to come to the next in this series with Barbara Ehrenreich. Thank you for coming.